Welcome to Fifth Quarter Bible, our Lesson 5 intro video in our Return from Babylon series. This week covering Ezra chapter 7 and chapter 8. So as always, let's jump into a review of our themes for this entire study. A brief review then of last week's lesson, and then what to look for in this week's study in Ezra 7 and 8. So first, our themes, our overarching theme, the faithfulness and sovereignty of God in keeping his covenant promise to bring salvation to all the people groups of the world through the promised seed of Abraham and before him, Eve. And so we see that God, again, is a covenant keeping God. He is faithful to keep his covenant, in this case, specifically to Abraham. But even before that, we had the covenants going all the way back to the garden, the covenant of redemption and grace. And we carry that all the way through to the new covenant that Jesus fulfilled. So God is a covenant-keeping God. He is sovereign in both judgment and restoration of Israel in the Old Testament, through which he keeps his covenant to bring forth Messiah to save his people from every corner of the earth. We see again the idea of a remnant. He had already saved the remnant. And this week we're getting into now a second wave of exiles coming back to Jerusalem, also part of his remnant, right? His people. The temple, which equals the presence of God. Now, at this point in our story, the temple has been completed. We have covered the first 6 chapters of Ezra, which covered that first return, led by Zerubbabel, led by Joshua, the high priest, and the prophets Haggai and Zechariah played their role in the completion of the temple as well. We have covered all of that. And so the temple is done by the time we're going to pick up in this lesson. Now the issue is going to be, what do we do with the temple, in the temple? There is going to continue to be some work done on the temple to beautify it, as we'll see later in this lesson. But as we transition to Ezra 7 this week, we'll really hit the importance of the primacy of the Word of God. That is where Ezra is going to step in, and that's going to be his legacy, more so than anything else, is that primacy of the Word of God. And finally, an avoidance of idolatry. A big part of that will in fact be this issue of making the Word of God primary, as it absolutely should be. So now, in a review of last week's lesson, which covered Ezra 5 and 6, and then an overview of the book of Esther very quickly. All right, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah were central to the rebuilding of the temple in their preaching and courageous encouragement. They also, or the challenge to the work of the temple in Ezra 5 and 6 that there was from the local officials was more administrative and less hostile this time. They wanted to make sure that this was actually something that the Persian king had ordered previously to be done and that the current Persian king was affirming. And so the work on the temple will prosper because of God's care, the preaching of the prophets, the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. All of these reasons, primarily, of course, would be God's care, would be the reason why the rebuilding of the temple was prospering at the time of this challenge from the local officials, I should say, that we see in Ezra 5 and 6. And this ultimately will result in royal confirmation that yes, the temple is to be completed, and actually they'll receive some government support and assistance along the way. And this shows us what we called in last week's lessons the Romans 8:28 principle. What was intended for bad, or could have turned out for bad, God actually uses it for the good of his people and ultimately his glory in the completion of the temple. We see here it took about 4.5 years to complete that temple once the work resumed, 20 years total from when it had started after that 15-year or so break. The sin offering that was offered there is evidence of humble hearts and faith in a covenant-keeping God. We covered the importance of that in that lesson. The Passover that was reinstituted at the end of that lesson points to Jesus, and those that can participate are all those who are set apart to God. Even there we see the inclusion of not just Jews, but those that had separated themselves from the world, and even more so, I would say, once the church age begins with Jesus and his ministry and the apostles, it's all those who are set apart, not just those of the ethnic people of Israel. And finally, in the book of Esther, we saw God's sovereignty on display to save his people and keep his covenant promises through the obedience and appropriate disobedience of his servants. And so if you haven't watched that lesson, I encourage you to go back and watch that teaching video from lesson 4. So now let's jump into what to look for this week, as we only covered 2 chapters in this lesson, Ezra 7 and Ezra 8. So in Ezra chapter 7, first look for Ezra's qualifications. How is he qualified to be the leader of this second return and just lead in the way that he's going to lead? That's going to be apparent as you're reading through these chapters now at the end of the book of Ezra. What were his qualifications listed there? What were some of the obvious ones and maybe some of the less obvious ones? What did he set in his heart to do? Now, a little, I don't know if it's a clue so much, but it's just something that, this is a very personal verse for me. This I would argue is one of my, it's definitely one of my top verses in the Bible in terms of as a teacher of the Word of God, but even just as a believer, just a powerful, powerful verse that will tell you what Ezra set his heart to do. So look for that as you read through chapter 7. King Artaxerxes' disposition toward God and Ezra. The king at the time of Ezra, what seems to be his disposition towards the one true God and towards Ezra himself? See if you can pick up on that. And what was the purpose stated in Ezra 7 for the king allowing this second return? So it's going to be very specific as to why the king allowed this next wave of people so many years after the first wave. We're talking several decades, many decades later. What was the purpose of this second wave? And as we get into Ezra chapter 8, what to look for here, the importance of the Levites. Ezra is going to place quite a bit of importance on them. See if you can pick up on that, not just from the text, but maybe through a little bit of research or previous knowledge. What is the importance of the Levites? Why fast? You're going to see that there's a fast in that chapter. What was the purpose of the fast at the time? But also, what is the general purpose of fasting that you can deduce from this particular text, or also, again, from what you know about biblical fasting? But why fast? God's deliverance. Take a look and see God's deliverance of his people in this particular chapter, and see if you can pick up on some of the details. And finally, the offerings, both the burnt and the sin offering. What was their purpose? What do you think the symbolism is here? Little hint, it does harken back to the last lesson to a great degree, so it'll be a similar point, maybe not exactly the same, but a similar point made here as well. So that's it. That is the intro video for this week's lesson. I pray you enjoy reading through Ezra chapter 7 and 8 this week, and that you'll be blessed by it. And we'll catch you on the teaching video in the next one. Take care. Bye.